Good evening, welcome to the Steele Center lecture. My name is James Dow. I'm the director of the Steele Center for the study of philosophy and religion. And the purpose of the Steele Center is to promote the study of philosophy and religion on and beyond the Hendricks campus. In doing so, we hope to identify, clarify, and contribute to an understanding of the emerging philosophical and religious issues of our time. And tonight, we're pleased to welcome Dr. Bryan Van Norden as our Steele Center lecturer. Dr. Van Norden is the James Monroe Taylor Chair in Philosophy at Vassar College and Professor in Philosophy in the School of Philosophy at Wuhan University in China. And his research focuses on Chinese philosophy and comparative philosophy. Dr. Van Norden has published 10 books in these areas, including Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy, an anthology in readings in Chinese philosophy, and a critique of philosophy's myopic focus on the West and Europe in Taking Back Philosophy, a multicultural manifesto, which it covers up here, which I recommend checking out. Dr. Van Norden has also written several engaging articles as a public-facing intellectual, for instance, Confucius on Gay Marriage, and If Philosophy Won't Diversify, Let's Call It What It Really Is, with Dr. Garfield, right? That article was, yeah. And tonight we're grateful he will share his research with us in his talk, Learning from Chinese Philosophy. So please join me in giving a welcome to our Steele Center lecturer, Dr. Bryan Van Norden.
Well, thank you very much for that very gracious welcome and introduction. I'm going to start out by giving you some statistics. So, in the United States, in which doctoral programs in philosophy can you specialize in Chinese philosophy? So suppose you wanted to write a PhD and write a dissertation on Chinese philosophy, where could you go and do that in the United States? Occasionally I miss a program or two, but this is a pretty representative list of the doctoral programs in the United States where you can study Chinese philosophy. And of course, this leaves out liberal arts colleges like Vassar, where I come from, or Hendricks here, but the professors who teach at places like Vassar and Hendricks get their degrees from doctoral programs. And so if they wanted to study Chinese philosophy, these are the places they could go. Might seem like a lot, but that's 13 out of the approximately 100 doctoral programs in philosophy in the United States, only about 13%. And if you wanted to study Indian philosophy, there are even fewer philosophy departments where you could study it. And if you wanted to study indigenous American philosophy, I think I counted 3 doctoral programs where you could study indigenous American philosophy. African and Africana philosophy are harder to count because some institutions you can teach African American philosophy, other ones teach African philosophy, but it's also a very limited number of schools. Why is this? Why are there so few places to teach any philosophy outside the Anglo-European mainstream? Well, when I ask my colleagues at other institutions why they don't teach philosophy outside the Anglo-European mainstream, why don't they teach Chinese philosophy, I get certain standard arguments. And in fairness, they're not very good arguments. So I'd rather just refer to them as sophistries, bad arguments, against teaching, for example, Chinese philosophy. One of them is people look me in the eye and they say, well, you know, Brian, the thing you don't understand is there is no such thing as Chinese philosophy. To which I respond, well, that's funny because I've co-edited and contributed to 2 anthologies about Chinese philosophy, so apparently there is such a thing as Chinese philosophy. Well, then they follow that up with, and people have really said this to me in published articles saying this, that, well, Brian, you don't understand. The English philosophy comes from the Greek philosophia, which is a Greek word. And so philosophy only refers to the intellectual tradition that grows out of Plato and Aristotle. There are several problems with this sophistry, but one of the most obvious is, if this were a good argument, then rigorously trained philosophers would simply not recognize as philosophy any of the so-called philosophy produced outside the Anglo-European tradition. But the fact is that they do. In fact, historically, when Jesuit missionaries went to China at the beginning of the 17th century, and remember, Jesuits are deeply trained in Western philosophy as part of their background training, they immediately recognized Confucianism as a form of philosophy. And the first translation of the Analects, the sayings of Confucius, into a European language was done by Jesuits who translated it into Latin under the title Confucius Sinarum Philosophus, meaning Confucius, the Chinese philosopher. When the Jesuits wrote back to people in Europe about this new philosophy they discovered, people there were really excited about it too. So for example, Leibniz, who is a standard figure on any history of early modern Western philosophy, was very impressed with the Chinese philosophy he learned about. He believed that the I Ching, the classic of changes, had independently discovered binary arithmetic, which Leibniz was the first to do in the European tradition. And he also was very impressed with the ethical teachings of Confucianism. And he remarked, certainly the Chinese surpass us, though it is almost shameful to confess this, in practical philosophy. That is, in the precepts of ethics and politics adapted to the present life and the use of mortals, as opposed to immortal angels. Another German language philosopher who you may not have heard of, but who was actually very important in the German Enlightenment, is Christian Wolff. And Wolff caused a controversy with a public lecture he gave, whose title might be translated, Discourse on the Practical Philosophy of the Chinese. And in this famous, or I should say infamous lecture, Wolff argued that we can learn from Confucian texts that it is possible to have an ethics without reliance on the concept of a god. This so outraged Christians in his home state that he was told to leave the state in, I think it's 48 hours, on pain of death should he not get out. But he had, as we would say in modern lingo, a good bounce, because he lost that job, but he bounced into an even better job at a different European university, where, undeterred, a few years later, he gave another lecture on the philosopher king and the ruling philosopher, in which he praised Chinese rulers for accepting the guidance of philosophers like Confucius and the later Confucian Modza. Well, it isn't just German language philosophers who were impressed with Chinese thinkers. Francois Kennedy is one of the founders of laissez-faire economics. And he wrote a book, Chinese Despotism, praising Chinese governmental models. Now, despotism in contemporary English has a negative connotation, but actually Kennedy was praising the way the Chinese rulers ruled. And in particular, he found in the example of the sage king Shun, who's praised in the Analects for ruling through non-action. And non-action, or wu-wei, doesn't mean literally not doing anything. It means not engaging in self-conscious or artificial actions. And Kennedy found in this a basis for, he claimed, laissez-faire economics. Later, US President Ronald Reagan actually cited non-action and the Tao Te Ching, the classic of Taoism, in one of his State of the Union addresses, indicating the long-term connection between laissez-faire economics and Chinese thought. I didn't say every idea that came from China was a good idea, but the idea does have its roots apparently in China. So how did things change? Well, this is a great book by my friend and colleague Peter K.J. Park, Africa, Asia, and the History of Philosophy, Racism and the Formation of the Philosophical Canon. And what Park shows through careful study of European philosophy textbooks is that in the 18th century, the 1700s, there were three dominant views about how philosophy started. The first major view in Europe about how philosophy started was that philosophy started in Africa, and from Africa, philosophy came to ancient Greece. The second major theory was that philosophy started in India, and from India, philosophy was imported to Greece. Now, I'm sure you can guess what the third major theory was. The third major theory was that philosophy started independently in both Africa and Asia, and both Africa and Asia gave it to ancient Greece. In other words, the view that philosophy started in Greece was a weird view that very few scholars took seriously in Europe in the 18th century. But then things changed, and they changed with the rise of pseudo-scientific racism. And I mean by that that the very notion of race was invented in the West in the modern era. And the notion that people's character could be determined by their skin tone, and that this would tell you something essential about them as a person, was invented and treated as if it were a scientific theory. But it's junk science. It's not a real scientific theory, so it's pseudo-scientific racism. And it was used to justify Western imperialism. And in philosophy, a major figure in this transformation, I'm sad to say, was Immanuel Kant, the great philosopher. It's going to be painful to read this, but we need to face up to what he said. In his lectures on anthropology, Kant certainly didn't invent the notion of pseudo-scientific racism, but he propagated it. And he hierarchically ranked the races with whites at the top. So Kant said, the race of the whites contains all talents and motives in itself, and only they are truly capable of philosophy. He said, and again, I apologize for even reading this out loud, the Hindus have a strong degree of calm and all look like philosophers. That notwithstanding, they are much inclined to anger and love. They are thus educable in the highest degree, but only to the arts and not to the sciences. They will never achieve abstract concepts. The race of the Negroes is full of affect and passion, very lively, chatty, and vain. It can be educated, but only to the education of servants, i.e. they can be trained. The indigenous American people are uneducable, for they lack affect and passion. They are not amorous, and so are not fertile. They speak hardly at all, care for nothing, and are lazy. Kant ranked people in East Asia at the second level with the people in India, saying, philosophy is not to be found in the whole Orient. Their teacher Confucius teaches in his writings nothing outside a moral doctrine designed for the princes, and offers examples of former Chinese princes, but a concept of virtue and morality never entered the heads of the Chinese. So Kant is, in other respects, a great philosopher, and his philosophy influenced many people after the publication of his The Three Critiques. And so his students revolutionized European philosophy, and as Park shows, they rewrote the philosophy textbooks, and they wrote Africa, Asia, and the indigenous American traditions out of philosophy. Now, most, not all, I have to say, but most of my contemporary colleagues in philosophy would reject the explicit racism of Kant's account, but they accept the tainted fruits of that account, the dogmatic assumption that there was never any philosophy outside the Anglo-European tradition going back to Plato and Aristotle. Now, I just want to note in passing, I'm really dumping on Kant, and he deserves it in this respect for his views on race, but there have been philosophers who have taken broadly Kantian ideas, and while being fully aware of the racism in the tradition, have also tried to reconfigure those ideas to make them emancipatory and to help diagnose problems like structural racism. Charles W. Mills is a great philosopher who passed away just a bit over about a year ago, and he was in many ways a critic of the liberal tradition and pointed out the hidden structural racism in that tradition. But he also thought that a form of liberalism stripped of this racism was perhaps the best option for human emancipation. Likewise, in the Chinese tradition, there's a liberal tradition going back to people like Hu Shi in the early 20th century, and represented by contemporary Chinese thinkers like Guo Yuhua, who she's a sociologist, but she's also a leading liberal thinker in China, and she sees, again, the liberal tradition recognizing its limitations as the best hope for the future. Now, of course, you don't have to agree with that. I'm just saying I want you to be aware that there have been progressive appropriations of Kant as well from people who are fully aware of the racist ways that it's often been used. But let's return to our story. So at this point, a final sophistry I'll sometimes encounter is people will say, okay, admittedly, there is philosophy in China. Admittedly, not all philosophy goes back to Plato and Aristotle. there may technically be Chinese philosophy, but it just isn't very good. Now, in the Supreme Court decision that legalized gay marriage, Obergefell v. Hodges, we're actually indebted here to Justice Scalia, because he said in print what many other people say to like-minded colleagues at the faculty club or whisper behind closed doors. And sometimes people saying offensive things in print is actually useful because you get them on paper saying what they really think. In the majority decision, the justices cited Confucius on the centrality of marriage as a human institution. They also cited the Roman philosopher Cicero. I don't want to step on anybody's toes, but I think Cicero's kind of a mediocre philosopher. But Scalia didn't have any problem with them citing Cicero, but he was outraged that they had cited Confucius in a Supreme Court decision. And so he said in his minority decision, "The Supreme Court of the United States has descended from the disciplined legal reasoning of John Marshall and Joseph Story, famous justices, to the mystical aphorisms of the fortune cookie." So he's dismissing all of Chinese thought as just the aphorisms of the fortune cookie. This is pretty offensive, and some people, in fairness, did try to defend Scalia by saying, "Aha, you're missing it, Van Norden. Fortune cookies are not an authentic Chinese food." True. And Scalia was criticizing the misappropriation of Confucius by comparing it to a fortune cookie. Now, I'm all in favor of charitable interpretations of text, but this is a level of three-dimensional chess that I can't read into it. I think if you know Scalia's other works, no, he meant just what he sounds like. This is just in line with a lot of other things he said. Well, how can we respond to that? Well, let's take a look. Is there actually any good philosophy in China? You can start the story of philosophy in China at different places, but one common place to start it is with the philosopher known in Chinese as Konsa. Confucius, by the way, is a Jesuit Latinization of his name, but he's usually called in Chinese Konsa. And he's a philosopher we have some pretty good dates on. He probably was 551 to 479 BCE. He lived in a time of civil war and social chaos in China. And he was trying to figure out, how do we get out of this situation of people being corrupt, governments being corrupt, everybody fighting other people, no one working for the common good. And his answer was to advocate rule by virtuous individuals. Well, Confucius knew full well that most people aren't currently virtuous, so how do you make them virtuous? He thought that virtue could be taught by a combination of habituation through the practice of the social rituals and rites, and the study of the classics of poetry and history. He also thought that because it's in the family that you first learn virtue, that filial piety and loyalty create what Western philosophers would refer to as agent-relative prohibitions and obligations. That's a fancy way of saying there are certain things I can't do to my parents. There's certain ways I wouldn't talk to my parents just because they're my parents, although I would talk very differently to someone else. And there are certain things I owe to my children because they're my children that I don't owe to other people. And Confucius thought that this is true, and it's because the family is the first place that most of us learn virtues and vices. And after his death, Confucius's followers collected his sayings in a work we know in English as the Analects, or in Chinese as the Lunyu, which probably means categorized sayings. Now just think about this for a second. Think about how this parallels, in certain ways, Plato. We learn from the 7th letter of Plato that Plato ended up thinking that there would be no end to troubles among humans until either philosophers became rulers or rulers became philosophers. And what he meant by philosophers was not nerds like me. He meant genuinely virtuous people like a Confucian Junzi noble. So Plato's solution to the social troubles he saw was to get virtuous people into positions of authority. And in the Republic, he gives an account of how you cultivate virtue in people, which has some similarities to Confucius's account, but also many important differences. And Plato is a paradigmatic philosopher. So why wouldn't Confucius also be a paradigmatic philosopher? But of course, not everybody agreed with Konsa. The next major philosopher is Modza, who lived in the 5th century BCE. As I say, he's the first major critic of Confucianism. He was a kind of universal consequentialist. So you judge actions or policies by whether or not they promote certain non-moral goods considered impartially. And in particular, as opposed to Western utilitarians who emphasize maximizing psychological states like pleasure or happiness, or more technically, preference satisfaction, Modza suggested we maximize things that we can socially observe and quantify, like wealth, populousness, and social order. And he advocated impartial caring. In other words, he denied that there are the kinds of agent-relative prohibitions or obligations, like obligations of loyalty or filial piety, that Confucians thought were central to human morality. Now, since he's challenging the Confucians, he's got to give us some kinds of arguments for why the Confucians are wrong. I mean, Confucius's main argument was, look around you, society's a mess. I'm giving you a proposed solution to that, which is itself a form of argument. But Modza's got to explain why he thinks the Confucians are wrong, and one of his most intriguing arguments is what I've labeled the caretaker argument. Modza starts out by saying, suppose there were two people, one who maintains partiality and one who maintains impartiality. And so the person who maintains partiality would say, how can I possibly regard the well-being of my friends as I do my own well-being? How can I possibly regard the parents of my friends as I do my own parents? And so when his friends are hungry, the partial person does not feed them. When his friends are cold, he does not clothe them. When his friends are ill, he does not nurture them. And when his friends die, he does not bury them. This is what the partial person says and what he does. But this is not what the impartial person says, nor is this how he acts. The impartial person says, I have heard that in order to be a superior person in the world, one must regard the well-being of one's friends as one regards one's own well-being. One must regard the parents of one's friends as one regards one's own parents. Only in this way can one be a superior person. And so when the impartial person's friends are hungry, he feeds them. When his friends are cold, he clothes them. When his friends are ill, he nurtures them. And when his friends die, he buries them. This is what the impartial person says and what he does. So he lays out very carefully these two opposed people. Obviously, he's advocating the impartial person, and he's accusing the Confucians of advocating the partial person. Then he presents us with a choice situation. He says, suppose one must put on one's armor and helmet and go to war in a vast and open wilderness where life and death are uncertain. Or suppose one was sent by one's ruler or high minister to the distant states of Ba, Yue, Qi, or Jing, and could not be sure of either reaching them or ever returning from one's mission. This is an illustration of this thought experiment by my colleague Helen de Cruz. Then Modza concludes, even though one may not advocate impartiality, one would certainly want to entrust one's family to the person who is impartial. But this is to condemn impartiality in word, but prefer it in deed, with the result that one's actions do not accord with what one says. And so I don't see what reason any person in the world who has heard about impartiality can give for condemning it. So the argument against the Confucians is supposed to be, you might say you prefer partiality, but when you're picking someone to care for your family, and he goes on to give a similar argument about picking a ruler, you will prefer the person who's impartial, which shows that you really prefer impartiality, although you say you prefer partiality. I'm not convinced by this argument. I think there's a flaw in it. But if you've been in a philosophy course, you know that most of philosophy is about teaching and learning about philosophers you think are wrong. So the fact that you disagree with a philosopher doesn't mean they're not a philosopher, and it doesn't mean they're not worth thinking about. So this is clearly, I think, a philosophical argument, and a pretty interesting one, although I'm inclined not to agree. Well, some people didn't agree with either the Mohists or the Confucians, and one such figure is Yang Zhu, who probably lived in the 4th century BCE. Now you'll notice that for Confucius, I gave him a movie poster because he's so famous that there's a Chinese government-funded biopic about it. Some pretty bad movies, don't recommend it, but there is one. And Modza got a stamp, an actual Chinese government stamp. Why doesn't Yang Zhu get a movie or a stamp? Well, you'll see in a minute. Yang Zhu is what we would describe in the Western tradition, I think, as an ethical egoist. That is to say, he thinks human nature is purely self-interested. Now, you gotta be careful. What that means is, Yang Zhu is not saying that everyone's motives are always self-interested. He's saying it's natural for your motives to be self-interested, but you can, through artificial socialization, come to have other motives that are not self-interested. But he says that's a perversion of your nature, and it's bad for you if you allow yourself to be socialized so you have other motives. Now, we don't have any writings we can directly attribute to Yang Zhu, so there is a hypothesis that, well, maybe he thought that human nature includes self-interested motivations and also some compassion for your immediate family. Why are we not sure what Yang Zhu thought? Well, after all, he's an egoist. Why would he bother to write down his teachings? What's in it for him if he writes down his teachings? And so it seems like he didn't actually have a lot of followers because he wasn't, generous with his time or interested in teaching them. He'd chat with you if it was fun, but he didn't have a school per se. But some people were inspired by his ideas, and there's a chapter in the Taoist work, the Zhuangzi, which presents a fictional dialogue between Confucius and Robert Jur. And Robert Jur is just a notorious criminal in ancient China. So the nearest analogy might be someone like Billy the Kid or Al Capone. So famous American criminals who are sometimes romanticized. And in this dialogue, Konsa or Confucius goes to Robert Jur to try to convince him to stop being a criminal. And Robert Jur refutes Konsa's arguments and condemns what he says. So let's see just a few passages from this dialogue, which I think, as I say, I think it represents Yang Zhu's ideas, although it was not composed directly by him. So Robert Jur yells at Konsa and says, "All right, stop talking. Now let me tell you something about the human essence. The eyes want to see colors. The ears want to hear sounds. The mouth wants to taste flavors, and the emotions want fulfillment. People live at most 100 years, usually 80, sometimes 60. Subtracting time spent recovering from illness, mourning death, and fretting over worries, there are only 4 or 5 days a month people can open their mouth and laugh. Heaven and earth go on forever, but people die when their time comes. Put this perishable good in that eternal space, and its time flashes by like a galloping horse past a crack in the wall. If you're not gratifying your wishes and cherishing your days, then you do not understand the way. I reject everything you say. Go home right now without another word. This way of yours is a crazy, fraudulent, vain, empty, and artificial business. It is no way to fulfill your true self." So all the key ideas of what I take to be Yang Zhu's philosophy are there. You've got a true self. This true self can be destroyed by an artificial, empty, and fraudulent teaching of morality that will lead you to waste your life pursuing morality instead of pursuing the satisfaction of your own self-interest. And this was a challenge to both the Mohists and the Confucians because although they disagreed about the details of it, they both thought that at some level, the right way to live, the right way to organize society requires a willingness to sometimes sacrifice your well-being for the sake of others. Well, the Confucian tradition was now under siege from the Mohists and from the Yangists, and the tradition might have died had it not been for this guy, Modza. And when the Jesuit missionaries got to China, they were so impressed with Modza, they gave him a Latinization of his name too, and so he was known as Mencius. So what did this guy, Modza or Mencius, do? He's a Confucian philosopher, and he specifically says that his historical task is to respond to the Mohists on one hand and the followers of the egoist Yang Zhu on the other. I interpret him as a virtue ethicist, that is to say, someone who particularly emphasized the cultivation of good character and thought that moral action requires complex responses to rapidly changing circumstances. So the best way to respond to those circumstances is to cultivate virtues like wisdom so you can flexibly respond to the situations you encounter. And he thought there were 4 cardinal virtues. The 4 most important virtues are benevolence, which involves compassion for the suffering of others, righteousness or integrity, which involves an ethically informed sense of shame. So in particularly, you'd be ashamed to accept a bribe, to give a bad judgment, or to cheat in a game. Wisdom is this kind of executive ability to find the best means to achieve your goals. And propriety, which Modza makes clear is the least important of the virtues, but is still a virtue, is skillfully navigating social situations with etiquette. And speaking as somebody who spends most of his life with his foot in his mouth, stumbling through social situations, it is a virtue, even if it's maybe the least important one. And frankly, I'm a fan of Plato, but I find these 4 cardinal virtues a lot more intuitive than Plato's wisdom, justice, temperance, and courage. Yeah, I got this. And Modza argued that human nature is good in the sense of having innate but incipient dispositions towards virtue, which he described using an agricultural metaphor as like sprouts. Because a sprout is something that can grow into a mature plant and bear fruit, and it's active and reactive, but it's not the fully grown plant yet. So likewise, the sprouts of virtue are your active and reactive tendencies towards virtue, but they need to be cultivated to fully develop into full virtues. Well, why should we believe that we have these things? One of Modza's most famous examples is the child at the well thought experiment. This is another illustration done by Helen de Cruz. She's got a book from Oxford of thought experiments illustrated. And I wrote the section on the child at the well thought experiment. And in this experiment, Modza just says, look, suppose any normal person all of a sudden saw a child about to fall into a well. How would they react? Wouldn't any normal person have a feeling of alarm and compassion for the child about to suffer? And he says that feeling is the sprout of the virtue of benevolence. And if you lack that feeling, you're just not a human being. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, well, that's cute, but that's kind of naive. Because there are some people who wouldn't have that reaction. Well, you know what? Modza is one step ahead of you. Because he does say that an ordinary human being would have the heart of compassion, that feeling of compassion, which is the sprout of benevolence, and that heart, he also says you'd have a heart or feeling of disdain, ethically informed shame, which is the sprout of righteousness. But he recognizes that some people might lack these reactions. And I'm dating myself here because this is a still from the movie Silence of the Lambs. And some of you are nodding, that's good. Some of you have seen the movie, terrific. If you haven't seen it, I mean, if you like thrillers, it's a pretty intense thriller, but it is a really good movie, so I would recommend it. This is Anthony Hopkins in like a career-making performance as the sociopath Hannibal Lecter. And Modza is not naive. He's living in a time of warfare and suffering. So he knows there are some people who won't have this reaction. What does he say about them? His response is the metaphor of Ox Mountain. He begins by saying the trees of Ox Mountain were once beautiful, but because it bordered on a large state, hatchets and axes besieged it. Could it remain verdant? Due to the rest it got during the day or night, and the moisture of rain and dew, it was not that there were no sprouts or shoots growing there. And the use of sprouts or shoot, again, is a conscious reference to the sprouts of virtue. But oxen and sheep then came and grazed on them. Hence it was as if it were barren. People, seeing it barren, believed that there had never been any timber there. Could this be the nature of the mountain? Now, and also if you're interested in environmental ethics, notice Modza's very aware here of the dangers of deforestation, because he knows what happens when you deforest a mountain and then the undergrowth is taken away as well. The topsoil washes away and now you can't grow anything there. And so, there are parts of the Monza where he warns rulers against allowing people to exhaust the soil or exhaust the natural resources. But here he's going to develop this metaphor. He says, so think of a mountain like this, which has been completely denuded. And you might think after a while, this is what the mountain's nature was. But it's not its true nature. Likewise, when we consider what is present in people, could they truly lack the feelings of benevolence and righteousness? That by which they discard their good heart is just like the hatchets and axes in relation to the trees. With them besieging it day by day, can it remain beautiful? With the rest it gets during the day or night and the restorative effects of the morning air, their likes and dislikes are sometimes close to those of others. But then what they do during the day, again, fetters and destroys it. So Monza concludes, others see that such a person is an animal and think that there was never any capacity there. Is this what a human truly is? Hence, if it merely gets nourishment, there's nothing that will not grow. If it merely loses its nourishment, there's nothing that will not vanish. So Monza offers the hypothesis that, yes, there are a handful of humans that do not have any compassion for others, but he says that is not their nature as humans. That is because their nature has been destroyed by bad environmental factors, just like a verdant mountain can be destroyed by bad environmental factors. Again, you needn't agree with Monza's conclusion, but again, he's anticipating objections, he's responding to them, he's using thought experiments to defend his position, he's using sophisticated metaphors to defend his position. Oh, and occasionally what I get from people, another sophistry is, well, but this is what I don't like about Chinese philosophy, is all the metaphors in it, and all the similes. Yeah, you're making the right faces, which is, have you ever read any Western philosophy that didn't have a bunch of metaphors in it? Right? People write entire doctoral dissertations on the cave simile in Plato, and nobody thinks they're wasting their time. I don't think they're wasting their time either, but the point is there's plenty of metaphors in Western thought as well. Okay, I'm going to talk about one more philosopher, and this is Zhuangzi. He gets a stamp too, because he's a really great philosopher. And he's usually classified as a Taoist thinker. The term Taoism is a little complicated because there really isn't a Taoist movement until later in the Han Dynasty when it becomes a religion. And retrospectively, certain thinkers were classified as Taoists who might not have recognized, they would not have recognized that term if you'd asked them, are you Dao Jiao or Dao Jiao? They wouldn't have recognized these terms. But he's typically classified as a Taoist philosopher. He writes in various genres, including philosophical dialogues, poetry, narrative. He presents arguments for skepticism, the claim that you can't know what the truth is. Other times he argues for relativism, the claim that the truth depends upon your perspective. Still other times he seems to be arguing for pluralism, the view that there are a variety of different goods and that it's not possible to instantiate all these goods in one life. If you think about it, it's not obvious how these views are consistent, right? If you claim relativism is truth, suppose you think, for example, well, truth depends on your individual beliefs about what is true. Well, then you shouldn't be a skeptic, right? Because you know what is true. It just depends on what you think is true. Now, on the other hand, if you don't know the truth, well, if you don't know what the truth is, you don't know that it's relative or plural either. So is Zhuangzi just too stupid to see the fact that he's advocating inconsistent views? I don't think so. Borrowing some terminology from Richard Rorty, I'd say that Zhuangzi's arguments may ultimately be therapeutic rather than systematic. I think Zhuangzi is trying to talk us out of certain ways of seeing the world rather than talk us into one particular way of seeing the world. Although in fairness, some of the most interesting interpreters of Zhuangzi are people who see him as trying to talk us into a particular worldview and then tell us what that is. But what I see when I read Zhuangzi is a guy who's always just trying to stay one step ahead of you. Just when you think you've got a nail down, he's like, oh, I'm going to pull the rug out from under you. Let me give you some examples. Zhuangzi never explicitly mentions Mengzi, but he's a younger contemporary of Mengzi's. And a lot of things he says, I believe, are clear attacks on Mengzi that his contemporaries would have recognized. This is an example, this line. Zhuangzi says, the sprouts of benevolence and righteousness and the pathways of right and wrong are all snarled and jumbled. Now, when we translate it this way, you guys immediately see, especially given how I've set it up, oh, this is a reference to Mengzi. It is. Our translation, as far as I've ever seen, is the only one to get this line right. Why is that? Because generally, people either really like Zhuangzi or they really like Mengzi. And very few people like them both or read them both equally carefully. So the people who know Mengzi well don't bother to translate Zhuangzi. And the people who read Zhuangzi, they read some Mengzi in graduate school, but they don't like him that much. So when they see this phrase, run each, or Duan, sprouts of benevolence and righteousness, they're like, what the heck does that mean? And it is a weird expression in Chinese, unless you know it's from Mengzi. And then you recognize it. So what does Zhuangzi mean? Well, this is an actual, I took this photograph when I was on a tour of a swamp in Indonesia. And the tour guide in the boat, we're in this tiny little boat, and he's like, oh, see, there's snakes in the tree. Look at the snake. And I'm like, there's a snake? Yeah, there's a snake right there. See a snake? See a snake? And I'm like, after a while, I couldn't see the snake. But after a while, I was like, oh, yeah, I see the snake. And click. I took like 18 pictures, pretending I could see the snake. And then I took the back to my room, and I blew up the picture. I think, if you look really carefully on that one branch, it looks to me like something's wrapped around it. I think that was the snake he was referring to. But the reason I use this photograph is, what is Zhuangzi saying? He's saying, Mengzi wants us to cultivate our sprouts of virtue. How do we identify the sprouts of virtue and distinguish them from the weeds of vice? And if you're going to nurture your sprouts of virtue, how do you know you're not actually nurturing something really bad that's going to later bite you? And again, you got the reference to Silence of the Lambs. This is Little Shop of Horrors. There's at least 2 movie versions of this. Maybe there's been another reboot I don't know about, but this one with Rick Moranis is a lot of fun. The original version of Little Shop of Horrors, movie version in black and white, which got Jack Nicholson in it, is also really cool. But this is a really fun version. It's a fun musical. Even if you don't like musicals, you'll have a fun time. So take this or download it, whatever people do. You know, feed it into your brain pod, or I don't know what people use for technology anymore. So. But yeah, you'll enjoy this. But yeah, but the point is, so Zhuangzi is like, well, how are you going to identify your sprouts of virtue and distinguish them from the weeds of vice? Intriguing argument. Does he have a more precise argument? There's a lot of very precise arguments in Zhuangzi. A lot of them have to do with very subtle points in the philosophy of language. I just don't have time to go into them today, but I'll give you maybe my favorite argument in Zhuangzi. And it's Zhuangzi's regress argument. Zhuangzi says, once you and I have started arguing, if you win and I lose, then are you really right and am I really wrong? Or if I win and you lose, then am I really right and are you really wrong? Now, Zhuangzi doesn't define winning and losing in arguments, but I think that's a strength of the argument. He says, you define them any way you want. Come up with any criteria that you think count as winning an argument. Maybe winning an argument means you convince most of the people who are listening. Maybe it means, well, you convince most of the well-informed people who are listening. Maybe it's like, no, you meet a set of criteria which we currently believe are the criteria for determining truth in argumentation. Any way you do it, you cannot believe that meeting that criteria guarantees truth. Why? Because there have been contexts in history in which people meet those criteria and they turned out to be wrong. Most people in Europe and most of the smartest people in Europe in the Middle Ages believed the Earth was the center of the solar system and the sun went around it. And that account met all the best criteria for saving the phenomena and Occam's razor and every other criteria you could have for knowledge, and we think they're wrong. So you can't believe that winning an argument makes you right. Well, is one of us right and the other one wrong? Or are both of us right? Or both of us wrong? If you and I can't understand one another, then other people will certainly be even more in the dark. Whom shall we get to set us right? Shall we get someone who agrees with you to set us right? But if they already agree with you, how can they set us right? Shall we get someone who agrees with me to set us right? But if they already agree with me, how can they set us right? Shall we get someone who disagrees with both of us to set us right? But if they already disagree with both of us, how can they set us right? Shall we get someone who agrees with both of us to set us right? But if they already agree with both of us, how can they set us right? If you and I and they all can't understand each other, should we wait for someone else? So all we know is that in certain social contexts, we deem certain people to be right in argument, but we also know, historically speaking, that does not guarantee truth. And Zhuangzi says, what else do you have access to? So it looks like a really powerful argument for skepticism. Now let's see how good you guys are as philosophers. Zhuangzi just gave us a really good argument for why you can't trust arguments. Is Zhuangzi too stupid to realize that if he's undermined arguments, he's also undermined his own argument? Or does he see it, and is he smiling, waiting for you to see the fact he already sees, which is that his argument against arguments undermines itself? I think he was smart enough to see that. And that's why, and it gets me because the people who Zhuangzi is often a big student favorite. People love Zhuangzi. A lot of the serious philosophers love Zhuangzi. But ironically, I find the people who often love Zhuangzi are the ones who are like, yes, Zhuangzi has told us the one truth of skepticism. And so I've learned from Zhuangzi that you can't know anything, and you fools think you don't know anything. You should see this great argument in which Zhuangzi proves you can't know anything. It's like, did you get the joke that Zhuangzi was making on you? I guess not. But now, if our arguments undermine themselves, should we not speak? Well, now we get to one of my favorite lines in all of Chinese philosophy. I'm actually more of a Modza guy than a Zhuangzi guy. They gotta admit, Zhuangzi is pretty cool. Should we remain silent? Zhuangzi replies, a trap is for fish. When you've got the fish, you can forget the trap. A snare is for rabbits. When you've got the rabbits, you can forget the snare. Words are for meaning. When you've got the meaning, you can forget the words. And the phrase rendered meaning here is literally "jur," pointing to. Where can I find someone who's forgotten words so I can have a word with him? So Zhuangzi doesn't want us to stop talking, but he wants us to recognize that all we can do with words is gesture to things that are beyond the words. And we can't become obsessed with the words. Boy, did any Western philosopher ever say a thing like this? Yes. At the end of Wittgenstein's Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, which is, by the way, another thing I get is, well, you know, I don't like Chinese philosophy because it's all just a bunch of aphorisms. You just saw, most of it's not just aphorisms. But even if it were, there's a lot of good philosophy that's done in the form of aphorisms. Like, for example, the Tractatus is a bunch of numbered aphorisms. And at the very end of Wittgenstein's a famous 20th century Western philosopher, and near the end he says, the things he said in the book, because it turns out, given the theory of meaning Wittgenstein gives you in the Tractatus, the statements in the Tractatus are not meaningful. And Wittgenstein knew that when he was writing, that according to his own theory of meaning, he cannot express what he's expressing in the book. How does he handle that? My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical, when he has used them as steps to climb beyond them. He must, so to speak, throw away the ladder after he has climbed up it. Whereof we cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. But Wittgenstein's a great philosopher, but that's because he wrote in German. He didn't have the bad fortune to write in classical Chinese like Zhuangzi. Thank you all. As they say in Chinese, I respectfully invite your correction. If you'd like to learn more, check out my book, Introduction to Classical Chinese Philosophy. Thank you very much. So I think we have time for questions. Should I just?
Yeah, we have about 10 minutes.
Great.
Feel free to raise your hands.
Yes. Oh, go ahead, please.
Yeah, thanks a lot. That was great. I love the comparison of Zhuangzi to Wittgenstein. And I just have a thought about interpreting Zhuangzi differently than as a skeptic or as a relativist, and maybe more in contemporary epistemic terms as a kind of externalist, in that he's skeptical of our internal rationalist justification of knowledge, and I think is maybe saying that's not what actual knowledge is. Actual knowledge is, our perspectival engagement with the world, right? So I wonder what you think about that. Would that?
Yeah,
You think
it's an interesting, interesting idea. I mean, I think one notion that many people have, not just me, applied to Chinese thought, and I think you'll be familiar with it as well, is the philosopher Gilbert Ryle's distinction between knowing how and knowing that. And quick footnote. I still teach Kant, despite the fact that, he's a real racist, but he has interesting things to say about the concept of human freedom and morality and I'm kind of a Kantian epistemologist, well, more Hegelian, but, so you can teach people that you recognize have done bad things. Gilbert Ryle was, I found out from a Chinese woman, a woman of Chinese descent who was his student, like a deeply racist guy. But his distinction between knowing how and knowing that has ended up being very influential on how people interpret Chinese thought, as I think you already know. So Ryle said that Western philosophy often emphasizes knowing that something is the case. So I know that Albany is the capital of New York. But other times you know how to do something. So I know how to swim. I know how to play poker. So a lot of Chinese thought is concerned with knowledge in the sense of knowing how to do something. And Zhuangzi gives us one of the classic examples of this, which is an example of a butcher who skillfully carves up an ox so cleanly and so perfectly and so skillfully that a noble person who's watching says, wow, I didn't know that skill could be this great. And the butcher sheathed his knife and said, what your servant cares about is the way, which goes beyond skill. I follow the heavenly pattern with my knife, Yi Hu Tian Li. And this notion, the pattern of heaven, or the heavenly pattern, becomes a term of art in later Chinese philosophy for the structure of the universe, which you have to accommodate as you move through the universe. And the way in which the butcher says, I haven't had to sharpen my knife in 16 years because I never hit a bone. I just slip in between the joints. And that becomes a model for how you should lead your life by following the heavenly pattern. And so, like I say, Zhuangzi is always undermining what you think. And so I say he gives this great argument for skepticism, but then you realize the argument for skepticism undermines itself. And then you realize the story of the butcher doesn't seem skeptical at all. It doesn't emphasize knowing that, but it seems that the butcher does know something, and he explains what he knows in terms of there being a pattern in the world which you follow. But notice that knowing how to do things, although we use words to teach it to people, it's generally not something we use a verbal account to adequately express our knowledge. My favorite example is touch typing. I mean, no offense to my high school teachers, but the best high school class I took was my typing class. I use that every day of my life. And back then, this is before laptops were common, so I was like the only, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but things were gendered, and so I was the only male in a class of women who planned to become secretaries. This was back in the day. And so I was the only guy learning to touch type. But now when I touch type, if you ask me what keys are under my fingers when I type, I've got to move them to find out. I don't know that this is under my right index finger, but I know how to type any letter I want to type. So that kind of disconnect between knowledge that's expressible in words and knowledge that's expressible in action, I think underlies part of what Zhuangzi is doing. And two fun things about this story. There's so many things going on in this story. Modza, the Confucian, tells a story in which he convinces a king that the king is capable of benevolence because he says, I know, your majesty, that you spared an ox being led to slaughter. And the compassion you showed for the ox shows that you can be a benevolent king if you would just extend your compassion from the ox to your own subjects. But then, in a weird comment in passing, Modza says, so this is why nobles like you and I stay away from the kitchen, because it hurts our tender sensibilities to see animals slaughtered. And so Zhuangzi doesn't mention Modza, but he tells a story in which a ruler is watching a guy slaughter an ox and learns the secret for how to live by watching the guy slaughter the ox. Again, clearly a reference, it's a jab at Modza. It's like, oh, you think you're too good to hang out in the kitchen? Well, maybe you should hang out in the kitchen. You'd actually learn something about how to live life. And so he can take jabs at Modza without ever bothering to mention him. The other thing I want to say about that example is, one of my famous useful oversimplifications, at least I hope is useful, is Buddhism plus Zhuangzi's Taoism gives you Zen Buddhism. Because when Buddhism came to China, the Buddhists in China had already read Zhuangzi, and they said, oh, I get it. So the way to realize that you have no self is to lose yourself in skillful activities like archery. There's a famous book, people don't read it much anymore, but Zen and the Art of Archery is a famous early Western book about Zen. Or swordsmanship can be a way in which you can lose yourself through a practical activity. And so this notion that you can induce enlightenment or express enlightenment through practical activities, which becomes characteristic of the Chan or Zen tradition, ultimately has its roots with the Buddhist encounter with Zhuangzi's examples of skillful individuals who manifest the way. So that was a very rich question. Thank you for asking that. What else? What are some other things that I said that were puzzling or that you wanted to follow up on? Sometimes the best question is, I just didn't understand what you meant by this, or can you explain that?
When Nietzsche says that we're all born with a heart and mind that cannot bear the suffering of others, is he right?
I think he is, but again, it's a sprout. It's just a sprout. And I'm not a psychologist, but what I hear from developmental psychologists is there's considerable evidence that even babies will show compassionate reaction for others. And even pre-verbal children will show a preference for people who are kind to others over people who seem to be unkind to others. And in a way, it's not surprising. My favorite example I use with students is, I wish I had a picture to flash of him, but I have a French bulldog. And we took out our French bulldog to the park to play, and this little kid was there, and French bulldogs are very friendly with people, and so he started playing with a little kid. But the kid had been brought to the park by his grandmother, and I'm a parent, I totally understand. My kids are grown up now, but she's like, oh, my grandkid's playing with a strange dog. I don't know this dog is safe. And so she just came over and grabbed her grandkid and pulled him away suddenly from our dog. I understand, she doesn't know my dog, she doesn't know he's friendly. Diego, my French bulldog, went nuts. Now, you'd think, well, this is like a 100-pound, grandma. But to Diego, this is a mammal that towers over him and outweighs him 5 times. And he's willing to fight to the death to protect this kid against what he thinks is a predator coming after his new packmate. Why is he willing to fight to the death over this kid he met a couple minutes ago? Because dogs are pack animals. You know who's else a pack animal? Human beings. And if you read Darwin's Descent of Man, Darwin is very clear. He takes it as obvious, of course humans have moral motivations, and evolutionary theory has to give an account of how these evolved, or it won't be plausible naturalistic account. There have been a handful of later evolutionary biologists who've been like, oh no, humans are purely selfish. That's, from Darwin's perspective, heretical. And I think now the pendulum swung in the other direction, and most people recognize humans are pack animals. We need to have reactions like compassion, or we wouldn't have survived. But Modza is right, it's just a sprout. And so that's why, Modza stresses this. The king feels sorry for the ox being led to slaughter. He's ignoring his subjects who are starving and being sent to death for hunting in the royal park because that's only for him, but they're starving, so they're hunting in his park. Or we feel we'd be ashamed to cheat in a ritual hunt, but we'll sell our principles for a ruler who gives us a big salary, and we'll sell out our own principles. So I actually find this plausible, but you look like you had a follow-up.
I teach Modza in my classes as well, and there's this claim in Mencius, which you mentioned, that Mencius says the difference between persons and beasts is slight.
Yeah.
And then to be a person, you have to be benevolent, you have to be compassionate, right? So, to my understanding, we're not born persons in Mencius, but we're born with the potential to become persons if we cultivate the sprout of benevolence or the heart and mind that cannot bear the suffering of others. But then now going back to the claim, if you don't have the beneficence or the ren, then you're not a person, right? I've recently run into problems with this idea when speaking to students on an autism spectrum.
Okay.
And I'm not a psychologist either, but there are, to my understanding, people who cannot see the suffering in others or understand, certain facial expressions that many other people would associate with suffering, and so they might not have the same empathy.
Yeah, no, and that's fair. And there's a famous example. I can share the link later, or you'll probably also find it. There was a neuroscientist who was investigating sociopathology, people who didn't have compassion for others, through brain scans. And brain scans are one of the best ways to definitively determine this. And he discovered that by looking at his own brain scan, that he doesn't have compassion for others, and he didn't know anything was missing. He knew that people thought he was kind of weird, but people think I'm kind of weird too. So, but he didn't realize what it was, and he said, "But I'm happy to share this because I'm not a serial killer. I'm not." Some people think I'm antisocial. The example he gave was, "I won't let my nephews and nieces win at games." I have no compunction at all just tearing them apart in children's games. I just don't get why you would let them win. And he said, but, I don't kill people, I don't steal, I don't murder. I've just made a conscious decision that I'm going to live in accordance with certain moral rules. And that's a more Kantian way of thinking about morality. I in a way, my whole career, and this is true even when I was an undergraduate, is at my gut, I want to believe there's a thing that's human nature, and that morality is captured by fully realizing that nature. But I'm aware there are a lot of problems with this view, one of which is that traditionally it's often been used to exclude certain people from humanity of different races. Aristotle infamously says in the Generation of Animals that a woman is a deformed man. He literally says that. So there's a bad track record for a lot of notions of human nature. So that's why some people, despite the problems in Kant, they're like, Kant gives you a better conception of what it is to be a human being. It's to be committed to ethical rules that you're willing to universalize for everybody. And we can take away from Kant the mistaken belief that some races aren't capable of this. And if we actually treat everybody according to these principles, we have a really defensible morality. So I'm torn by this. The example of people who don't feel compassion but can nonetheless, I identify fully as fellow human beings. I see the problem there. But for most people, we do feel like this is part of what we expect in other people, that they have these reactions. So as a generic claim, a claim about what most human beings we interact with and what we expect from people are like, it seems like it's accurate, and developmental psychology seems to bear it out.
Thank you.
We can continue the conversation at the reception in the Mills Library, and let's thank Dr. Van Norden for sharing his wisdom.
Thank you.